We are the Community Diversity Group. Our mission is to foster an inclusive and interactive community which attracts and retains a pool of potential employees and residents from underrepresented groups. We accomplish this in many ways, including sponsoring events like the Community Resource Fair, publishing a monthly resource flyer, and providing public training and educational and networking events. You can find us online at communitydiversitygroup.com.
You are not alone. Domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking affect our entire community. The Center County Women's Resource Center provides services to men, women, and children inclusive of all gender identities and sexual orientations. All of our services are confidential, professional, and free. We provide counseling, advocacy, emergency shelter, information, referrals, support groups, legal representation, and more. If you or someone you know needs help, please call our 24-hour hotline at 1-877-234-5050. Your safety and privacy are our primary concern. For more information, to get involved, or to donate, please visit us at ccwrc.org.
You're watching CNET, Center County's Government and Educational Access Network.
I want to welcome everybody to Penn State's Celebrating African American Literature and Language, Race and Resistance Conference. We are honored to have so many scholars, teachers, creative artists, and community activists joining us to celebrate African American literature and language. We embrace this opportunity to come together to share our work, our visions, our questions, and our challenges as we grapple with issues of deep cultural, social, and political import. It is, I am certain, no surprise that this year's conference was prompted in part by the massive social movements like Black Lives Matter and Say Her Name, movements to expose and challenge state-sanctioned, racially motivated violence against Black and brown bodies, and by the ongoing efforts to affirm the dignity and humanity of Black and brown lives everywhere. In African American literature and language, there is a long tradition. Actually, there are long traditions, multiple and plural, of challenging myriad forms of oppression through the promotion of self-definition, creative expression, and aesthetic innovation. And there is, as our keynote speaker, Mary Helen Washington, shows in her 1990 introduction to Black Eyed Susans, a long tradition of writers and scholars finding a sense of community and connection and purpose through their relationship to movements for social change. This year's conference offers an opportunity for us to reflect collectively on how African American literature and language practices, both historically and in the contemporary sense, inform and are informed by movements of resistance. This event, well, first of all, how's everybody doing this morning? All right, guys, you doing good? Good, and everyone made it here okay? Yeah? Good, there we go. Okay, people are waking up a little bit. Welcome to Penn State, right? It's a little chilly, it's a little brisk, but it is a beautiful fall day, and we'll stay nice and warm and cozy here. We'll keep you fed, we'll keep you intellectually engaged, and hopefully we'll keep you motivated to keep coming back. So, but there are a number of people that I want to thank for sponsoring this event. The list is long, so I do want to take a moment to acknowledge each one of our sponsors. First of all, the College of Liberal Arts, the College of Liberal Arts Undergraduate Studies, the Africana Research Center, the Center for American Literary Studies, the Department of African American Studies, the Department of English, the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor Keith Gilliard. When you get to that point, you get to sponsor events, right? The George and Barbara Kelly Professor Eldon Nielsen, the Equal Opportunity Planning Committee, and the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Diversity, and Penn State's Outreach. I also want to thank our planning committee, for their commitment in carrying out both the logistical and the intellectual work that it took to bring this conference together. Elda Nielsen, Keith Gilliard, Laura Varana, Madiwa Pettis. Can Laura and Madiwa raise their hands? Where are they? There they are. Thank you. These young folks are the ones who managed both their graduate work and the work that it took to bring this conference together and to keep it kind of young and vibrant and tech savvy. So we want to really thank them. We have the Facebook, and Twitter. That's all them. I also want to thank John Ferris, Joyce Reed, Don Lavera, and the entire administrative staff in the Department of English. The time that it takes to do this conference is time away from other duties and responsibilities, and I really appreciate everybody's time and support and commitment to this event. I also want to thank one of our former students, Nadia Delane. She designed the poster art for the posters and the programs, and we want to thank Nadia for that. And finally, I want to thank our featured presenters and our conference participants who have come from all over the country to share with us your work, your energy, and your creativity, and your general fabulousness. We look forward to the next 2 days of what I'm sure will be illuminating, challenging, and invigorating dialogue. I would now like to invite Dean Susan Welsh to the podium to say a few words of welcome.
Well, thank you, Shirley, and on behalf of the College of the Liberal Arts, I'm delighted to welcome you to this conference on African American literature and language, focusing on how African American literature and rhetoric inform and are informed by resistance. I know we have scholars here from all over the country, and I welcome you all. I know many of you have been here before, and to you, a special welcome. I'm really glad you've come back. So it looks like we'll have nice fall weather for your conference, but I know that the intellectual excitement generated by the talks and papers here will shine brightly as well. In looking over the paper topics, I am very impressed by the interdisciplinary reach of the conference. I see aesthetics, politics, geography, poetics, music, feminism, performance theory, history, art, film, and more come into play as important topics and insights into African American literature and resistance. It's really an impressive list of papers and topics, and I know you will be stimulated by them. This conference is co-sponsored by many organizations, but I want to mention specifically the Department of English and Departments of English and African American Studies and the Africana Research Center. I also would like to thank Shirley and her leadership team for their tremendous work in organizing the conference. It's appropriate that our Departments of African American Studies and English sponsor this conference. African American rhetoric and literature have been an important part of our English curriculum and graduate training for many years, and now the Department of African American Studies has adopted a dual title PhD program, and they are in the process and will in the future be training scholars of many disciplines to teach and do research in African American studies. Now, I hope you will have time to enjoy yourself in the larger campus community while you're here. The Palmer Museum is just a few blocks from here. It has interesting exhibitions, including one by satirist Adolph Dane and other caricaturists such as Thomas Nast. The Creamery is just a few blocks beyond the Palmer and is always a popular stop. We have an aperitif by Leonard Bernstein going on here tonight, tomorrow night, and Saturday. And the Warsaw Philharmonic is also in town. So there's plenty to do should your sessions end before midnight and you have a little time. So enjoy your conference. I'm really glad to see you all here, and I hope it will be as productive and stimulating as it certainly looks. So thank you.
Thanks, Susan, for welcoming us. I am not going to go over the list of everybody to thank because we've already done that. But I'm Mark Morrison, the head of the English department, and I know how much work that conference planning committee has done to plan this conference, and especially how much Shirley has done. So we should give everybody another big round of applause for working on this. But welcome to the conference, and I am. This is, to me, often the intellectual highlight of the year, and it has a long history that I also won't rehearse. But I've watched this conference evolve over the last decade to take the form that it's currently in, and Shirley and Val King really transformed the conference into what you see today, and so Shirley has given us another fantastic conference. When Susan was mentioning the long history of African American literary studies in this department, I was thinking back to one of the first courses in African American literature in the country was offered by a colleague, Dan Walden, who just passed away relatively recently, back in 1967, I believe. It was quite a... It was earlier than that? Okay, back in the 60s, I'll say. And so we have a long history here. But I want to thank Shirley for bringing together a group of scholars from relatively young scholars in the field to luminaries who you'll all be hearing from. And it's also nice to welcome back to this conference scholars who were our doctoral students. And I am just looking through the program, I see Pia Diaz, Alex Lockett, Will Langford, Greg Perot, Nadia Delane, and Sarah Rube Walker. I'm not sure who all is here in the room right now, but it's great to have you back and welcome back. I also want to add that not only have people come from all over the country, but from as far as Taiwan for this conference. So we have quite a group of people who've traveled a long way for this. And so I won't keep you waiting much longer to hear from Mary Helen Washington, but I want to say too that this conference is a strong example of something that we value very much here in our program, which is the ongoing interdisciplinary cooperation among scholars in the arts, literary studies, creative writing, history, African American studies. All the synergies that come from these collaborations really strengthen not only our doctoral program, but I think the field in general. And I always look to this conference to get a sense of where the field is now and also where it's heading next. And so I think this is the place to really take the pulse of the field, and it's an exciting moment for us all. So welcome everybody. I think the weather has cooperated. It was rainy and nasty yesterday, and you've got a good one today, so enjoy yourselves. I'll turn things over to Cynthia Young, who is the head of the Department of African American Studies and also the interim director of the Africana Research Center, which is a major supporter of this conference. So I'll let her do the introductions, but have a good time, everybody.
Well, I just want to add my welcome to those that have come before, to say that we're really excited to be hosting the conference, and we're really excited to have you all here. I'm Cynthia Young, the head of African American Studies and the interim director of the Africana Research Center, and I've been here exactly 3 months. So I am brand new to the university. So luckily, people before me have talked about the longer history of the study of African American literature here at Penn State. What I want to say is that what's so great for me about this conference is that it's sort of steeped in my training. I was trained by Marcellus Blount at Columbia University in the 80s when these kind of multiple traditions of black feminisms, the anti-apartheid struggle, gay liberation movements, the black arts movements, all of these things had kind of created a very exciting moment in African American literary studies at that time. And that training has really kind of stuck with me. And I guess two things that I would say have to do with, on the one hand, the kind of urgency that has always undergirded African American literature, the sense that black writers have been social critics have been, have tried to hold the U.S. and other spaces to a kind of standard regarding human rights, regarding justice, regarding, the role of the state in all of our lives. And what's particularly exciting for me is that now we're here in this moment of incredible urgency, right, in the country, right? It's a moment that, it sometimes feels like every week we're hearing about another death, another protest, and the kind of state's violent response to it. And one thing that I sort of think about as I think about this conference is that we're coming together as part of this long tradition of speaking back to the state, speaking back to others who don't necessarily understand justice as fully as some of us would like them to. And this conference, I think, is part of this moment in African American literary studies that we will look back on in 20 years and think about as an urgent, creative moment in the way that we think about the 1970s and the way we think about, slave narratives in the 19th century. And so, what I want to just encourage and encourage you to do and think about is the way in which all of what we are doing here collectively is speaking to both a larger tradition, but also a kind of urgent social moment. So welcome and have a great conference. Sorry, I touched someone's thing.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Cynthia Young and welcome her again. It is just an honor and a pleasure to have you joining us here and bringing all of that energy and intellectual vision to Penn State. Thank Mark Morrison again for the ongoing support for the conference, and of course, Susan Welsh for their support of the college as well. So it is now my honor and privilege to introduce the University of Maryland Distinguished Professor, Mary Helen Washington, who, if anyone was at ALA, knows that she took the genre, well, it has been taking the genre of the introduction, but again, took the genre of the introduction to a whole new level. Professor Washington has had a transformative impact on the fields of American studies, African American studies, and literary studies. In her work as an editor, researcher, and scholar, she disrupted the existing ways of reading and interpreting American and African American literature and culture. And as a mentor and teacher, she cultivated generations of emerging scholars, teachers, educators, and activists. Her disruptive practice began in the 1970s when she became part of a small band of scholars who founded the first Black Studies program at the University of Detroit. Her work inaugurating Black Studies was not just a matter of institutionalizing a discipline or field of study, but rather emerged in the aftermath of the 1967 uprisings in Detroit and reflected a deep commitment to struggles for social justice and political equality as carried out in the joint work of scholarship, teaching, and community activism. During this time, she cultivated a practice which she would most famously articulate in her 1997 presidential address for the American Studies Association of disturbing the peace. I was waiting for you all to answer that. Of disturbing the peace, where peace has meant the institutionalized silencing of dissent, the marginalization of Black and brown peoples, especially women of color, and the suppression of radical Black literary and aesthetic traditions. Her work at the University of Detroit included publishing essays in Black World, working with and publishing in the feminist press, and earning tenure at a Jesuit university. As she notes in her journals from this period, it also included helping students plan a dramatic performance of literature of the Harlem Renaissance for Black History Month, traveling up to the University of Michigan for the first meeting of the Michigan Black Studies Association, and planning a trip to Jackson State Prison to teach a course on Black literature. Dr. Washington's practice of disturbing the peace was rooted in what she so beautifully names the extraordinary experimental work being done in Black studies, the work of loosening up disciplinary boundaries, the opening up of traditional disciplines, and the theorizing and historicizing of notions of race, gender, class, and nationhood. It is also rooted in a deep sense of social responsibility and a radical understanding of teaching, scholarship, and activism as mutually constitutive activities. Dr. Washington continued her practice of disturbing the peace with her publication of Invented Lives in 1975, Black-Eyed Susan's Midnight Birds in 1980, and Memories of Kin, Stories of Family by Black Women Writers in 1991. Through these texts, Washington helped move Black women writers from the margins to the centers of American and African American literary study, asserting that the most important aspect of this literary renaissance was the change these writers made in the way Black women were represented in literature. She continued to reframe Black women's writing through her introductions to the 1988 reprint of Anna Julia Cooper's A Voice from the South, the 1990 reprint of Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, the 1979 collection, I Love Myself When I'm Laughing, and then again when I'm looking mean and impressive. As one of Mary Helen's former students, Sean Meyer, so eloquently states, it is, quote, in the capacity as editor that Washington transformed the genre of the introduction, for it is within the prefatory textual space of the introduction that Washington produced the knowledge and analyses that, in Houston Baker's words, were required to establish the conditions of existence for a gendered, that's Sean's word, Afro-American literary history. Washington's scholarship on Black women writers not only shifted an entire discipline, helping to inaugurate a new area of study, but also cultivated a new generation of scholars and teachers who, but for Washington's work, might not have found their way to this field. For me, like many others, my encounter with Mary Helen Washington's work became a pathway to a career in literary studies that I'd hitherto never imagined. I remember as a sophomore undergraduate reading Mary Helen's introduction to Their Eyes Are Watching God. In it, she wrote about a simple question, quote, does Janie find her voice, that set off an impassioned debate among scholars at this national conference called the MLA. Washington's foreword served as my entree into the field. It showed me how the world of criticism mattered and how it could be imbued with our personal, professional, and political convictions. Later that year, I decided to become an English major because I wanted to be part of the conversations that Washington described in her foreword, and because what Washington described made it possible for me to imagine a place for myself in the academy. Washington's most recent scholarship continues her courageous, field-defining work with the same integrity and piercing insights that characterized her earlier scholarship. In the other blacklist, the African American literary and cultural left of the 1950s, Washington meticulously details the terrain of a new area of American literary study. She draws together an archive of African American literary and cultural production that has been suppressed not only by the repressive anti-left forces of the 1950s and on, but also by the very practices of canon formation, represented, for example, in the seemingly innocuous construction of the Norton Anthology of African American Literature. As Washington constructs this archive, she offers us new ways of reading the political acts and aesthetic practices represented in these marginalized and suppressed texts. In the other blacklist, Washington places at the center of our literary histories the aspects of Black studies that have been most marginalized, obscured, and suppressed. Traditions of Black radical resistance and action emerging from the Black cultural left. Washington's practice of disturbing the peace has led to the transformation of disciplinary fields in intellectual and literary histories. It has been characterized by a politics and practice of engagement with her students, with her colleagues, with local and national politics, with the women in her community and at her church, and with her 10 nieces and nephews, which we hear about regularly. As another of Mary Helen's former students, Chris Brown, states, Mary Helen's, quote, lived politics serve as an example to all scholars to reach beyond the library in their work. And I would add, as a model for continued practice of disturbing the peace. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce our opening keynote speaker, Professor Mary Helen Washington.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming out this early in the morning. Am I being heard? Is this good? Okay. And thank you to all the people that organized this conference. I have to say that even in the half an hour I've been down here this morning, it just feels like such a warm and engaging and important conference. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you to Shirley. I have to say that when Shirley talks about me, I feel really proud of myself. thank you for reminding me of those things and placing them in such a generous light. Since my book, The Other Blacklist, African American Literary and Cultural Left, was inspired by people who were blacklisted, jailed, and hauled before investigative committees, the theme of resistance seems like the perfect topic for me. I'll begin and try to go fast so we can get to questions and answers. In the winter of 1950, the Atlanta University-based journal, Phylon, published a literary symposium to assess the state of Black literary production at mid-century. The symposium was constructed from responses sent in by 23 prominent Black writers and academics. Among them were some of the creative writers who were pretty well known: Gwendolyn Brooks, Hugh Gloster, Arna Bontemps, Langston Hughes, George Schuyler, Sterling Brown, Margaret Walker, William Gardner Smith. Among the academics, am I being heard when I look? Okay, all right. Among the academics were Hugh Gloster, J. Saunders Redding, Charles Nichols, and Blyden Jackson. The most prominent absent voices included the leftists, W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, the ex-communists, Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright, and the open communists, Lloyd Brown and Abner Berry. 12 of the 23 were college professors, 11 of them on the faculty of major Black universities. It's the conservative voices in this symposium to which I devote special attention, because in the early 1950s, they were the original, they were in the ascendancy in the 1950s, and they became the catalyst for my recovery of the Black Popular Front. The questionnaire included the 3 questions that you see before you. The first 2 were really throwaway questions. It was the 3rd question that most interested the editors and seemed to garner the greatest response from the respondents. And that 3rd question: would you agree with those who feel that the Negro writer, the Negro as subject, and the Negro critic and scholar are moving toward an unlabeled future in which they will be measured without regard to racial conditioning, to racial origin and conditioning? I will begin with the response from the most conservative respondents to this questionnaire. Hugh Gloster, a professor at Hampton Institute, literary editor of the 1948 anthology Negro Voices in American Fiction, and later longtime president of Morehouse, fired off the first shots for the conservatives. I want you to listen carefully to this. I'm quoting him at length here. Racial subject matter, he wrote, had handicapped the Negro writer, retarded his cosmic grasp of varied experiences, diminished his philosophical perspective, and lured him into cultural segregation. Gloster praised Zora Neale Hurston and Ann Petrie for freeing themselves from their, quote, racial chains by not writing about Black characters. And he singled out Willard Motley's 1947 novel, Knock on Any Door, for, quote, lifting his work to the universal plane by representing humanity through an Italian boy. He praised Gwendolyn Brooks and Ann Petrie for dealing with women's issues, which he said were not racial matters, since they dealt with womanly concerns such as passion, marriage, motherhood, and the disillusionment in the lives of contemporary Negro women. Most of this is quoted matter. The novelist and critic J. Saunders Redding carried on in Gloster's vein, urging the Negro writer to register human rather than, quote, racial values by testing them in creatures of his own imagination who were not Negro. Charles Nichols of Hampton Institute saw a, quote, heartening maturity in writers who were not primarily concerned with Negro life. And he predicted that the Negro writer was in the process of coming of age, though, he wrote, happily not as a Negro. Ebony associate editor and writer Arabelle Thompson wrote that integration and full equality for blacks were so close at hand that writing about Jim Crow racism should be discarded as a relic of the past. White editors, she claimed, are only interested in the quality of a writer's work, not in the color of the skin, and black writers need only be ready to take advantage of these opportunities. Remember, this is 1950, December 1950. White journalism, she continued, apparently unaware of the irony of the term, has always been open to the Negro, but never to the extent that it is today. I'm not making this up. N.P. Tillman of Morehouse College and a Phylon editor agreed with Thompson that there was no bias in the book business. Quote, the American reading public accepts a book by a Negro now on much the same basis as it receives a book by a white author. Continuing with this blithe optimism, Fisk University professor Blyden Jackson wrote, quote, all around, the air resounds with calls to integrate the Negro into our national life. Even Langston Hughes, whose entire literary output could be described as culturally black, found it, quote, a most heartening thing to see Negroes writing in the general American field rather than dwelling on Negro themes solely. And he too praised Willard Motley, Frank Yerby, Ann Petrie, and Dorothy West for presenting non-Negro subjects and thereby lifting their work to a universal plane. Alan Locke, who had a reputation and a connection with the left in the 1930s, jumped on the universal bandwagon as though he was in sheer terror to be left off. He employed the term universal 11 times, admonishing black writers to achieve a, quote, universalized particularity, to find a way to write about race from, quote, the universal point of view, to write about racial life from the third dimension of universalized common denominator humanity. He was struggling with this word universal and trying to get black people inside of it. In the end, he declared that outer tyrannies like segregation, racism, and the exclusion of black writers from the mainstream of literature and publishing were a part of the past and no longer posed a serious problem for the black writer. He insisted that the only things restricting black writers were inner tyrannies, conventionality, repressions, and fear of race disloyalty. The poet Sterling Brown, who's also in this questionnaire, later wrote that the Phylon Group had turned integration into a literary passing. I am introducing my paper today with this historical turn to the 1950s because the Phylon issue is such a telling sign of the pressures and anxieties of the Cold War. The symposium respondents were reproducing almost verbatim the official State Department line that racism, and I'm quoting now from a State Department memo, was a fast disappearing aberration. Racism was a fast disappearing aberration capable of being overcome by talented and motivated individuals, that by minimizing racial identity and racial strife, they could promote an image of a democratic and racially progressive United States, especially abroad. In effect, the Phylon Group was offering race invisibility as a bargaining chip for American citizenship status. I also want to use this moment to trace a genealogy of black radical aesthetics, countering the Phylon conservatism that, for me, begins with a 1951 essay in Masses and Mainstream by communist writer Lloyd Brown, because it offers such a sharp counterpoint to the symposium's discourse of integration, a narrative I consider a narrative of Cold War modernity based on rejecting racial radicalism. And let me talk for a minute about this essay, because you probably have never seen this essay, never read it. I've never seen it republished anywhere. Certainly not in any anthology. It's not in the Norton Anthology, which of course is the gold standard of African American literary anthologies. It's not even in Gerald Early's 2-volume collection of essays, Speech and Power, really quite exhaustive collection. When Brown, a former communist organizer and associate editor of the Marxist journal Masses and Mainstream, and soon-to-be published novelist, read the symposium issue, he fired off an almost immediate response in the form of this 2-part essay called Which Way for the Negro Writer, published in the March and April 1951 issues of Masses and Mainstream. So you can see how fast he did his work, because the symposium was in December, and his 2-part essay comes out in March and April of the next year. Brown began his critique in true Marxist fashion by connecting these cries for universality to American imperialism and to the domination of the white ruling class, who, he said, believed that so-called inferior cultures must be remolded to conform to the Anglo-Saxon ideal, end quote. He insisted there's no contradiction between Negro subject matter and Negro forms on the one hand and universality on the other. Any notion, he believed, of universality that excludes black people, black life, and black forms is simply, again, quote, an acceptance of the abysmal standards of white supremacy. To the voices clamoring for black literature to eliminate blackness, Brown wrote defiantly in his essay, Negro literature has not been Negro enough. Let me repeat that. Negro literature has not been Negro enough. And if he were in the black arts movement 20 years later, he would have been saying black enough. I think I'm forgetting to put my slides up there. Okay, so there's the Phylon Review of Race and Culture, one of really the premier literary and cultural journals for African American literature of the 1950s, and a picture of a young Lloyd Brown. And his novel, Iron City, the first issue from 1951. And then I've included here a cover of Masses and Mainstream. I'm going to say a little bit more about this journal later, but consider that Masses and Mainstream covered African American literature and culture more extensively than any other journal, any other mainstream journal, and again, almost never represented in any anthology. And this is the first page of his essay, Which Way for the Negro Writer. As part of his larger critical strategy, Brown included an analysis of the material conditions of black literary production. He began by pointing to the record of the New York Times, noting that in 32 pages of reviews, articles, and advertisements in the 1950s issues of the New York Times Book Review, no work by a black writer is mentioned. He continued, none of the bestsellers in the Times is by a Negro, nor is there any mention of Negro writers in any of the books recommended in the Times. Taking his critique beyond current publications to the academic literary establishment, Brown consulted with the editor of Masses and Mainstream, Samuel Sillen, who had done extensive research on the journal, the 1949 3-volume journal, Literary History of the United States. Both Sillen and Brown noted that neither Negro writing nor the Negro people merit a single chapter in this work of 81 chapters. In his final expose of Phylon's fantasy of mainstream acceptance, Brown reminded his readers that Atlanta University's journal Phylon, in which these conservatives were announcing the new day of integration, was a segregated quarterly published by a segregated university located in Georgia, a state that was represented in Congress by segregationists. Perhaps the most strikingly modern aspect of Brown's essay is that he imagined African American literature in global terms and race as an international issue. The Black American writer, he said, is united in the world of imaginative literature with those great writers of socialism national liberation and peace, including Gorky of Russia, Lu Xun of China, Neruda of Chile, O'Casey of Ireland, Guillen of Cuba, Aragon of France. These were the leftist writers that he considered giants of the earth and part of the literary world black writers should have claimed. Brown contended that at the moment when the attention of the entire world, and he meant Europe and the Soviet Union, of course, was focused upon Negro oppression and struggle in our country, these black writers of the symposium were accusing themselves of writing about narrow racial issues and minority questions, when in reality he reminded the Phylon readers and respondents, these are subjects that are, quote, bound up in world issues. What I want to continue highlighting here is how and why these dominant currents in African American literary production continued long after the Phylon Symposium. I also want to briefly examine the political technologies of the Cold War that produced and circumscribed the acceptable discourse on race. And of course, I now turn to some of those technologies. As early as 1947, the Attorney General had begun labeling organizations that were involved in anti-racist work as subversive. President Truman's Loyalty Board was holding hearings at which advocacy of racial equality was a justification, an official justification for a heightened scrutiny of federal employees. That blackness itself was considered subversive is borne out by the rhetoric of the un-American investigation committees. Advocating racial equality or civil rights, or even listening to a Paul Robeson recording were grounds for having one's loyalty questioned. According to British historian of the Cold War David Coate, witnesses in loyalty hearings were routinely asked such questions as, do you think that an outspoken philosophy favoring race equality is an index of communism? Interracial friendships and interracial dating could also be a sign of communist activities. When they began to investigate the WPA's Federal Theater Project, one of the things they cited them for, they cited them for communistic tendencies, for having mixed castes and for having Negroes and whites dating and dancing together. Senator Albert Canwell of Washington State, he was the chairman of one of those investigation committees, announced that, quote, if someone insists there is discrimination against Negroes in this country, there is every reason to believe that person is a communist. Cold War rhetoric around issues of race was constructed through, of course, a vocabulary of coded terms. Gradualism, moderation, and a focus on racial progress defined what was considered the vital center and the acceptable position on race. Successful blacks like Marian Anderson and Jackie Robinson were held up as indicators of racial progress, while civil rights activity, especially something as militant as, say, the Civil Rights Congress, was disparaged. And I could just tell you this little story about Walter White. He was at that time chair of the NAACP, and the NAACP was about to be named as one of the subversive civil rights organizations. And to get their way out of that, of course, they began to take a much stronger anti-communist line. He published an article in Look magazine in 1949 that was reprinted in Negro Digest the same year, called Has Science Conquered the Color Line? And in this article, White advocated immediate investigation into a new scientific discovery, monobenzyl ether of hydroquinone, which promised to make blacks white. I am not making this up. I read this article. Once monobenzyl was perfected, the scientists claimed, the skin of every Negro could be changed to white, which caused White to ask, hopefully, quote, would not Negroes then be judged individually on their ability, energy, honesty, cleanliness, as are whites? And then he concluded, almost entirely without irony, that this chemical could hit society with the impact of the atomic bomb and conquer the color line. This is just how far this kind of racial, I guess I can call it neoconservatism went. None of this black and red baiting surfaces explicitly in that Phylon issue, but Brown was politically attuned to detect the ways that a seemingly innocuous phrase like Negroes moving toward an unlabeled future signaled neither unlabeling nor real integration, but capitulation to a right-wing assault on black resistance. As an editor at a Marxist journal where these issues were debated openly, he and his colleagues were more willing and freer to call things by their real names. And in a way, I almost feel as though the left and communism, that this was one of their great strengths, that they could name things in a way that people in the mainstream were afraid to. They used the term white supremacy when those of us who were children in the 1950s were being molded into good little anti-communists and always instructed to use the term prejudice. One of the main reasons that Brown's Masses and Mainstream essay should be entered as one of the central texts in African American literary history of the 1950s is that it unmasks the coded Cold War rhetoric that produced the racial paranoia of the Phylon Symposium and the coded race rhetoric of the 1950s. Moreover, Brown's essay identified what Bill Maxwell would later call in FBI's the institutional networks for the national, international surveillance of black culture set in motion by J. Edgar Hoover. I want to make now just a brief tour before I end to Brown's 1951 prison novel, Iron City, published 2 years before what has become the most officially canonized modernist novel, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Because Iron City challenges that view that modernism, that Ellison's was the only modernism, and that modernism could only emerge out of estrangement from political commitment. Brown inaugurated what I call the black left literary modernism, using as his models for formal experimentation left-wing literary and cultural texts of the 1930s, like the Living Newspaper. And I turned to the Living Newspaper because when I talked to Lloyd Brown, he said very explicitly that that was one of the sources for his novel. So when I went back to look at the Living Theater, I found there one of the programs that emerged out of the Living Theater was this Living Newspaper. It was a kind of traveling political theater that dramatized current social problems, and it was intended to make audiences move toward action or toward reform. Now, I've never seen a Living Newspaper. I've only read about them, but they must have been a stunning spectacle because they incorporated mass media documentary, spectacular staging techniques, short vaudeville sketches, music, song, dance, personified characters, and documentary material that came right out of a current newspaper. So let me talk about just 3 of them, or describe 3 of them. One was called Stars and Bars. It depicted the problem of black slum housing by featuring a personified death, leading syphilis, tuberculosis, pneumonia, and infant mortality in a macabre waltz until the 4 diseases snatched the black children out of their parents' arms and tossed them off stage into the audience. Now, I don't know how they did this. Another newspaper, Liberty Deferred, featured these 2 couples from Manhattan, one white and one black, touring the United States to learn about black history. Near the end, a huge map of the United States would appear on stage, covered with little doors, one for each state, out of which actors' heads would pop, in blackface for the segregated states and in white for the others. Then a character named Jim Crow would step out of the scene and into the frame with the two couples in order to demonstrate to them and to the audience that his power to segregate extended even to New York City. The most successful living newspaper was called One Third of a Nation. Its title referred to 1/3 of the nation that lived in poor housing. That theater featured a gigantic cross-section of a tenement building, which was made to collapse on the tenants at each performance, so successfully that the stage had to be reinforced each night. So out of his borrowings from the living newspaper, Brown crafted his novel Iron City, which I call a hybrid product of documentary impulses and modern literary influences. In Iron City, often unmediated by the narrative voice, are newspaper clippings, radio broadcasts, political pamphlets, taped voices from a prison wiretap. The three main characters in Iron City are three political prisoners. There would be prison regulations listed, a script of prisoners' voices, and even an extended parody of Native Son. He included direct historical references to the Cold War so that he could critique things like the Smith Act. In the novel, the three black communists are in jail with the prison population, and they become part of the prison world through acts of shared resistance with the other prisoners. And I'm truncating this at this point. Let me just call your attention to the fact that he uses one of the political prisoners like the everyman in the living newspaper who would come out on stage. So he appears in the novel and tells a story of different events, including one story about this massive lynching that took place in Georgia in 1946. And I found this one representation of that quadruple murder, which was actually originally reported in We Charge Genocide that was submitted to the UN by Robeson and William Patterson. It's in We Charge Genocide, they documented this quadruple lynching of 4 sharecroppers in 1946. They were 4 friends who had been recently married in a double wedding ceremony, shot at point-blank range by a white mob, and so mutilated that they were buried in closed coffins in a quadruple funeral ceremony. And this was an event that was really quite well protested at the time. 50 or so black women marched in front of the White House about it, at huge protest rallies about this murder. And the only place that I've ever seen this murder represented in fiction is in Iron City. And there in Iron City, the one thing that he does, the one kind of modernist technique that he does, that he chooses, is he imagines that scene as a scene of collective mourning. And he has a collective chant by all of the prisoners in the prison as they hear this story. He also imagines that one of the lynched people is an ex-Iron City prisoner. And the point that I want to make about the way he represents that murder, that mob murder, is that at a point when most of his contemporaries consider Richard Wright, Chester Himes, Ann Petrie, William Attaway, Margaret Walker, were deeply skeptical about the possibilities for black Americans in a U.S. capitalistic structure, and they represented the national landscape almost exclusively as one that was irreparably fractured for black Americans. And at this time, when black modernism could only be recognized if it moved away from political meaning, Iron City moved against both of those tendencies and created out of the spirit of those 1930s forms, created in a 1950s novel a working class insurgency inspired by the improvisation of those cultural forms. I don't know of any other novel in the 1950s that does that. I mean, in a sense, it's both this improvisatory, modernist novel And at the same time, it takes on these urgent political issues with a real sense of the possibility of collective power. So I recognize the same Cold War biases in the stunning absence of Brown and his radical contemporaries in contemporary African American literary histories. To take the most well-known and influential anthology, since it's the gold standard of anthologies of African American literature, I turn to the Norton, and I want to note that they labeled the period from 1940 to 1960, Brown's period, as realism, naturalism, and modernism. Now, you might even be able to tell from this chart that there's something anomalous about number 4, and that period is labeled as though formal literary categories emerged full-blown without any ideological or political context. This is a particularly problematic construction, considering that this period covers the political landscape in which black writers and intellectuals were intimidated, arrested, interrogated, indicted, jailed, deported, and blacklisted. We could talk about the assault on Paul Robeson, the arrest of Du Bois, the HUAC investigations, the silencing of Langston Hughes, the denial of passports to Robeson and Du Bois, the labeling of every civil rights organization as subversive, and all those FBI files. And what we get is realism, naturalism, and modernism. I could talk in great depth about how truly disturbing it is to read that section in the Norton that has eliminated almost any reference to the Cold War and the left. But instead of doing that, I'll just show you what my revision of that period would look like. Uh-oh, it doesn't, did it come down? There it is, okay. So, I would rename this period the Black Popular Fronts, the Cold War, and Civil Rights. And in my collage in the back, I don't know if you can see everything, I have a 23-year-old Lorraine Hansberry in the top left-hand corner. In 1942, you can't see it, but she's working at Paul Robeson's Freedom. I have Langston Hughes being interrogated before McCarthy's committee. And then moving toward the right, Paul Robeson and others presenting the We Charge Genocide to the UN in 1951. Below, I have a photo of the founding members of the Committee for the Negro in the Arts, another leftist civil rights organization that lasted from 1947 to 1954. It was cultural, it was political, it was resistant. Founded in New York in 1947, and there among them are the actor Walter Christmas, the artist Charles White, Ernie Critchlow, dancer Janet Duncan, all leftists. The section would include literary journals like Masses and Mainstream, Freedom, Story Magazine, the Chicago Defender. Obviously, there'd be a section on the Red Scare and the rise of anti-communism, FBI files, Masses and Mainstream. You can see all the ways in which I would reconstruct that period. And what I would hope to do with that kind of revision is, of course, first of all, to recall the role of an interracial left, led principally by a black left, and the fact that until the late 1950s, it was these left-wing clubs, schools, committees, camps, publications that constituted the principal venues for the production of African American literary culture. Thank you.
that'd be great. If you're too shy, then we'll pass it over to you.
Okay, Chris.
At the risk of ruining your wonderful talk, would you tell us a little bit about where you see Ellison in this this wonderful reimagining of the anthologies? I just started teaching it this semester, and I just finished teaching the prologue, and so I have, of course, not gotten to the epilogue yet. And so there's this kind of ambivalence across the sort of trajectory of the novel. And I wonder if you might imagine a kind of aesthetic of ambivalence about the sort of place that Ellison finds himself in this debate.
Well, I certainly wouldn't leave Ellison out. I mean, this is a very quick draft of what I would do in reimagining that period. But certainly under the Red Scare and the rise of anti-communism, I would fit Ralph Ellison. And I'd fit him in there. You know, Barbara Foley has that wonderful article where she traces the way anti-communism works in Invisible Man. And, you know, I think that's the way I would teach it, that there is throughout a kind of anti-communism that needs to be decoded. And then I would also talk about this, about the novel as a modernist novel because, you know, obviously it has all of the signs of literary modernism. I would consider it kind of mainstream literary modernism. And I would teach it in tandem with Lloyd Brown's Iron City to talk about the ways in which those two kinds of modernism work and, you know, and to what end. You know, I'm trying to think about, you know, the ambivalence of the political ambivalence in Ellison's Invisible Man, I think is brought out very clearly in two characters. One is Mary Rambeau, and the other one is Brother Jack. And those are the two characters that represent black political resistance. I think it's Brother Jack who gives the iron, the leg iron to the Invisible Man, and he says that he got that leg iron because he refused to say yes to a white man when he was on the chain gang. And he gives him that leg iron. Mary Rambeau takes the Invisible Man in to the community. I mean, she has that community house, and she's always encouraging him in some way when he's the most down and out. Those two characters are the least represented in the text. They are the least represented. They have the least narrative space in the text. So I would ask, you know, that's the way I would teach it, as the ambivalence that you see there, because the characters who get the most attention are characters like True Blood, whom you certainly cannot admire, and whose incestuous relationship with his daughter is, I mean, that's not the most reprehensible thing. I think the most reprehensible thing is that he ends up figuring out how he can make money off of his story. And the other character is the college president, Bledsoe. Huge amount of narrative space given to these characters who are opportunists, who are you know, in a sense, the very opposite of the characters of resistance. So why is there so much attention to those characters and so little to these other two? So that's the way I would teach it. And I would say, you know, I think it's hard to, it's certainly hard to say anything about Ellison's intentions. But I would talk about that novel as being one that got immediately accepted into the mainstream. And I would say, you know, why? Because it seems to me that it fits with the sense of ambivalence about political resistance. You knew that I was going to say that.
Morning.
Good morning.
Thanks so much for your talk. I learned a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I thought it was really quite brilliant, and I'm excited by your use of print culture. And so I have a question about a couple of things. One is if you could talk a little bit about your process for digging out some of these things that were unfamiliar, such as your, not only the print, but also your conversation with Lloyd Brown that you mentioned, but especially with respect to print culture. I'm really fascinated if you're looking at a series of photographs in this last shot compared to the hand drawings and I guess lithographs that you showed earlier. It seems like most of the scenes, if I'm recalling properly, most of the scenes of most of the illustrations you used were not photographs. The photographs I remember are the cover of Phylon and Lloyd Brown in his young days, but most of them are line drawings like this. As I said, it looks like a lithograph or maybe an engraving. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could say something about your process with Black print culture and also just comment on this, vivid disparity between the photographs and these kinds of images. Thanks.
Okay. Well, I could start with my relationship with Lloyd Brown. I knew him for the last about 12 years of his life. And I think over those 12 years, he must have sent me a letter once a week. He was very, very interested in getting down on paper the things that he had lived through and had written about. So he would direct me, for example, to pages in the New York Times and in the Chicago Defender and say, be sure you see this. And they would be things that I would never even think about looking up. Trying to think of what else. Finding photographs. The only way I was able to find most of the photographs that I found was by personal connection. So when I went through the Charles White archives, I was actually at Charles White's son's house, and he would hand me things. I got almost everything that is in my book, I got right out of his archives, and that was, again, because of a personal relationship. For example, that picture of the Committee for the Negro in the Arts was in Charles White's house, sitting somewhere on a table. I had never seen all of those people in the committee, which may be one of the reasons why CNA, which is short for Committee for the Negro in the Arts, is so unknown in African American history. It's because the pictures of those people were just, it was not, these are not people that had cell phones, and so they, and they didn't know, in a sense, how important those meetings were. The other place that was a great resource was the Archives of American Art downtown at the in the National American Art Archives collection. Few photographs, but more posters, for example. The poster of, there was a two-play, in fact, I think I might even have it on here. It actually is down there in the lower right-hand corner, and it's the poster for a series of plays that Alice Childress put on with her plays and Langston Hughes' plays. And the poster is called Just a Little Simple. That's what they call the evening program. It's called Just a Little Simple. I don't know where I got that. It was in, one of those archives. But what I found out by looking at it was they put this program on in 1950, I think it was 52, at the Club Baron, which was a left-wing playhouse, which ended up being closed by the Attorney General's, subversive list. So it was two left-wing playwrights producing this play at a left-wing playhouse, and it was to raise money for the Civil Rights Congress. So there was that constellation, of community work, political work, literary work, all being done. And I found that out by looking at that poster. Believe me, these things are very hard to come by in the 1950s. But thank you, that's a really good question, and that's where my work is right now, trying to find more of those visual aids.
That was just a really thrilling talk, and I was just very pleased by it. I'm wondering if you could say more about the relationship between these traditions that you're drawing out in your kind of final image map and those conservative movements that you talk about in terms of Phylon. In particular, the universalism that you ascribe to, which I think is brilliant and absolutely right, to those conservative writers. Is it a simple matter of opposition? Do we find a more or less direct opposition between these critical and radical perspectives and those conservative perspectives? Or is there, I mean, I'll tell you, in part I'm thinking about, like, Saunders Redding. You talk about his appeals to a universal black writing, and I'm thinking about his later claims, but only slightly later, about Native Son and about Wright's departure from the United States, and his claims that essentially Wright is leaving behind a fundamental aspect of his identity, and his work is thereby impoverished. So what is it? So this is a question that could be answered in any way you feel like it, but but it's
you're asking me what's the relationship between the people who were represented in Phylon and the people that I've put up here?
Yeah, let's just leave it at that. Yeah.
You know, Lloyd Brown is probably the only person who made that particular kind of critique and just, drew out what they were doing, because there was a lot more interaction among these people than you would see from Lloyd Brown's, kind of left-wing stance. For example, Langston Hughes is probably friends with all of them. He's over here on the left, but he was one of the main people in the Phylon Symposium, right? Saying, it's a good thing we're not writing about Negroes anymore. Many of those same conservatives might have been at Just a Little Simple play. They also, though, really kept their distance from the left when it became really critical to do so. I don't have any more biographical, insight about that than that there was a lot of cross, work between people that I now posing as on the right and these people who seem to be on the left. I'm drawing a much greater distinction than there would have been at the time. And some of those people that I'm calling conservative were considered liberals then, and would be shocked that I'm calling them, conservative. And, it's really by, in this moment, I can look back and see that was a conservative position. They were all pretty aware, though, of staying away from communists. They were aware that there was a kind of anti-communist line that they needed to espouse. They could not have been unaware that they were all saying, let's become universal and not Negro. And, just from my own experience growing up in the 1950s, that is what we heard. We heard that you wanted to be universal. And in fact, now, in most crowds, you stand up and say something, and I'll tell you, the first white person who stands up will say, is that universal? So it's like it has not left us. In fact, Ziegler, who's just written a book on the Red Scare, he calls it our Red Scare social skills, that we all still have. Mm-hmm.
Hi. I just love to see this work on the 1950s and mid-century modernism. And I would add Langston Hughes's Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz.
Yes,
which I've written about as an Afro-modernist text. And certainly this is not the same timeline if we're talking about, Anglo-European or Anglo-American modernism. So I have my own way of thinking about this, but I'd really love to hear your ideas about 50s being modernist for African American writers and maybe the relationship between modernism and modernity for African Americans at that time.
One of the things that makes it hard for me to do that, aside from Langston Hughes, Alden probably can answer this better than I can.
The answer is poetry.
That's what I was going to say, that if you look at the poetry, that's where the modernism is. I just finished teaching Robert Hayden, and of course I'm very aware of the poets really trying to, to make these modernist moves, whereas, and this is what's so anomalous about Iron City, is that it's one of the only novels that I could find that has that kind of political sophistication in it, bite, sharp critique in it, that also plays around with things. And that was so interesting with Lloyd Brown. And I think it was because he was a communist. I have to say, I think it was because he was a communist that he could play around with things, that he could, he was deeply influenced by those 1930s texts, which he had, seen some of them himself. And putting them in his novel was just the kind of playfulness that he, had no problem doing. He wasn't trying to become, another Ralph Ellison. And he wasn't trying to appeal to a mainstream. I can't think of another novel from the 1950s, another African-American novel from the 1950s, that has that kind of modernist tendency. But it is there in the poetry.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
We have time for some more questions.
Just in thinking about your response to the question around universalism, I mean, I think another way of recasting it might be to say that the Black left was actually calling out these more conservative writers for not being sufficiently universal. In other words,
that's true.
Rather than thinking about it as universal identity, the Black left was talking about universal conditions, right? Like
yes.
that decolonization and that slavery represented a kind of, and capitalist exploitation represented a way in which the world had been structured such that there were these masses of people who were in the condition of the oppressed, and there was a much smaller group that was in the condition of oppressing. And so in some ways I feel like the Black left presents a more kind of universal picture of what conditions actually structure the country and the world, as opposed to this kind of fictive universal humanity that is really bankrupt. I think what they're saying is that that's actually not universalist.
And thank you for that, because I cut that out of the talk. It's where I say, he is redefining universal. And there's this, universalist conception that actually includes the whole world. You said it beautifully, though. It's exactly my sense.
Hi, I just wanted to return to where you ended here, and outside of us aiming to one day hold an editorship at the Norton, what do you prescribe for a canonical translation of this scholarship? I mean, we're almost 2 decades into it. I mean, your work along with Bill Mullen and others. Yeah. I mean, we're beginning to enter a second wave of this. And, thinking of Mullen's earlier 2001 breaking the signifying chain, how do we kind of, undermine this residual anti-communism that still shapes our canon?
Well, you just named it. I mean, if I put up the books on my bookshelf from Bill Mullen, Bill Maxwell, James Smethurst, Alan Wald, Cynthia Young, okay, so now I'm blanking, Barbara Foley, and 10 others, there is now enough material on the 40s through the 1960s to make that a really rich period, and a period in which all of these debates would be part of the way you would structure that section. You wouldn't necessarily structure it as I have here, I'm biased, but that there was a whole series of antagonisms, messy debates, and you would have to include FBI files. I mean, the FBI files are central texts of the 1940s to the 1960s. Ellison and Albert Murray, who of course I put on the conservative side, they wrote about Lloyd Brown. I mean, they were having antagonistic, comments about Lloyd Brown in their letters. So there was lots of interaction among these people. And so I would, start with all the outpouring of scholarship that's now in this period.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's have another round of applause. Thank you.
AAUW State College advances equity for women and girls through advocacy, education, philanthropy, and research. Please join us as we celebrate 100 years as a branch. Led by Harriet CAALL, a Penn State professor's wife, we formed in 1916. We began by advocating for Penn State women students and the appointment of the first woman to the Penn State Board of Trustees. From the beginning, we've helped meet needs faced by women and their families in our community, speaking out to educate others about those needs. Started in 1962, our used book sale funds scholarships for women to complete college, provides grants to local nonprofits, and finances AAUW-led projects. For 100 years, we've identified key issues, used our influence, and met with public officials to get things done. Our STEM programs help girls prepare for their future, and we have more work to do. Equity is still an issue. We stand up for what we believe in. Join us as we celebrate 100 years of making a difference in our community.